Thank you. We are going to start panel 4, Changing the Lens. And we'll start with Sharon Dempsey. Sharon Dempsey is a Northern Irish-based writer. Her new novel, The Midnight Killing, was published in 2022. She's undertaking a creative critical PhD at Queen's University, exploring representations of the female victim in Northern Irish crime fiction. The novels explored in her corpus represent contemporary Northern Ireland, often negotiating trauma from the recent past, and operate within the subgenres of the police procedural and the domestic noir. The PhD creative component takes the form of a novel in the subgenre of the domestic noir, and it is called After the Party. It is in part inspired and informed by the highly publicized account of the Belfast rape trial of 2018, which involved 4 Ulster rugby players. Sharon has published 5 novels and 3 nonfiction books and has many short stories published in anthologies, literary journals, magazines, and broadcasts on radio.
This conference has proven that there is power in storytelling, but my paper today argues that there is power in reading stories in a new and different and imaginative ways. So I want to think about the stories we tell ourselves, the stories that are told about us, and how we understand society through stories. Now, I've no content warning for you, instead a disclaimer. For this paper is situated within the scholarship of crime fiction. So I apologize in advance if I talk about dead bodies in the context of entertainment. It can seem flippant, but beyond the entertainment factor that often goes along with crime fiction, there are serious points to be made. And I argue that in reading crime fiction through the lens of the female body, we can gain understanding into societal attitudes that pertain to violence against women. Such a reading offers an opportunity to revise ideas of victimhood. So I'm talking about textual centrality of the female victim. Now that's some of the big stuff, but I also promise to talk about fairy tales later on. Now, it is a truth universally acknowledged that normal people enjoy murder. While watching documentaries about crime and murder, to be more precise, and when not watching them, we're reading crime novels, a genre that continually outsells all other categories. Look at any popular culture on any format, television, films, documentaries, podcasts, even TikTok videos, and you will find documentaries about real-life cases. Taylor Swift has even written a song inspired by our obsession of true crime. It's called No Body, No Crime, which also happens to be the title of my thesis. So what is it about the allure of crime stories? Well, for starters, this isn't a new or recent phenomenon. Elements of crime fiction existed in the Old Testament, Shakespearean plays, and the genre came into popularity in the late 18th century. The Newgate novel was a true crime form of journalism, and it led the way for fiction based in crime and detection, but it goes way beyond that, way before it. Now, for Edgar Allan Poe, death and beauty are one. Famously, he wrote, "The death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world." So there's this preoccupation with beautiful dead female, and it's one that has prevailed in art and literature. This obsession continues today. Just look at any real-life crime case that involves a white, blonde, preferably middle-class woman. It will have saturated press coverage, and I can't help thinking of the Sarah Everard case. And while it was worthy of all that coverage, other cases like Shadika Mushin Patel, who was killed on a street in East London, or in June the same year, the Black sisters Nicole Smallman and Bibba Henry were stabbed to death, also in North London. They didn't receive the same outpouring of grief. Clearly, society places a higher value on female victims who are young, white, pretty, and mostly middle or upper class. This ideal victim is often presented as virtuous, feminized, and even infantilized, unblemished and idealized. She is denied her true identity, and instead the narrative depends on her being without flaws, which is in itself dehumanizing. Without doubt, there is misogyny embedded in this presentation of the pretty dead girl as something to be gazed upon. Well, let's dig a little deeper to understand what it is about the beautiful dead female that so inspires, intrigues, and pleases. Okay, in death, the female body loses its power of animation and agency. An aesthetically pleasing corpse, according to Bronfen, and I quote, suggests harmony, wholeness, and immortality. This is because femaleness and beauty place the distance between men and death, an enabling of the anxieties around decay and sexuality to be eased. As Professor Ruth Bernard Yeasel tells us in the London Review of Books, for the masculine artist to represent a dead woman is to simultaneously confront mortality and also to deny it. I quote, "There is death," he effectively says, "but it's not my own." As corpse or cadaver, the body then assumes this new role, that of symbol, a manifestation of anxieties concerning our own mortality. So Cartesian divisions hold that the mind is a powerful tool contained in the body that's seen as burdensome. Now, feminist critics have argued that there is a gender bias in this due to the priority of the mind over the body. Additionally, Elizabeth Gross refers to dualism when she states that women are considered somehow more biological, more corporal, more natural than men. And this has been crucial to understanding the power relations relating to sexual difference. So do you see what's going on here? It's this entrenchment in corporeality that's contributed to men's patriarchal privileges. Furthermore, this concept of corporeality of the female has been apparent in crime fiction with the proliferation of the dead female. Writing in the Irish Times, academic Claire Clark says, popular culture is dominated by the spectacle of the beautiful dead girl, but she argues it is our duty not to avert our eyes from dead girls. Rather, we owe them our fiercest, most penetrating attention. So the dead girl term, or as a trope, draws attention to our cultural obsession of focusing a narrative on a dead girl who becomes little more than a plot device to allow the story to begin. Alice Boland here writes in Dead Girls, Surviving, Essays on Surviving an American Obsession, crime stories are ubiquitous in our culture, not only for their transgressive lure, but for their power to reinforce social order. So let's unpack this for a moment. What is that social order? Oh, wait. It's the one where women are most understood as being victims, that they are in danger from men. Now, I promised you a fairy tale at the beginning, and I want you to think back to when you were a child, hearing the story of Little Red Riding Hood for the first time. Can you remember what your instinct was when you heard the route that Little Red Riding Hood had to take through the deep, dark forest? It's the same instinct we feel when we watch a horror movie and the lead actress is about to go down into the dark, dank basement. We shout, "Don't do it." We can barely watch because we know something bad is going to happen. And we almost laugh because we recognize that sense of dread. We are Red Riding Hood going into that dark forest. We are the half-drunk girl walking home alone. We are said to have placed ourselves in danger. That there is an inevitability about what will happen next. And it is this supposed inevitability that basically permits it. So back up a minute. How clever, how cunning is it to create an entire narrative that basically says we are responsible for the bad behavior of men, that it is our deviance, we're the ones that have gone into the dark forest, that leads to our downfall, that men, those poor hapless creatures, cannot be held accountable for what happens under the cover of darkness. Women with their bodies, think back to what I said about Elizabeth Gross, were somehow more biological, more corporeal, more natural than men. And then when we're not the pure infantilized girl, we are the temptress, the femme fatale, the woman in the attic who has gone mad. So this goes beyond victim blaming. It's an externalization of the heteronormative need, the biological impulse to want women's bodies, and it is placed firmly at our feet. It is our feeling. So cycling back to the trope of the dead woman, Alice Boland tells us dead girl stories are ultimately about uncovering female darkness and revealing male innocence. The pretty dead girl represents an absence on which the protagonist, or even us as the viewer or reader, can project our own fictions. As Boland states, the dead girl is merely a neutral arena on which to work out male problems. But in reading this trope in a different way, through a feminist lens, we can inform how we view the misogyny that gives rise to it. So how does all this relate to my genre, crime fiction? So at the heart of crime fiction lies the victim. Nearly all crime fiction is concerned with the body and how the body is read for information pertaining to the victim's last movements in order for the process of investigation to begin. Now, while that victim is central, she, and it is usually she, is closely looked at yet unknown. Rarely is the narrative concerned with the victim. Instead, it's the murderer and the detective who are central. Despite this, I assert that crime fiction provides an opportunity to incorporate a feminist agenda that centers the female experience. So the object of a crime novel also is to deliver some sort of justice. Yet the body is overlooked and rendered to the shadows. Critic Jill Plain says this is a deep structural irony. The body is seen but unknown. The corpse is a contradictory sight within criminal fictions. So moving on to my creative thesis, I just want to contextualize all this within the work that I'm doing for my PhD. So fourth wave feminist movement, with its focus on sexual harassment, body shaming, rape, and other pertinent issues, have given us a wider conversation about what constitutes sexual abuse and also how we talk about it. So within this cultural debate, we have seen the development of sexual crimes as being integral to the plot of crime fiction narratives. This has gone along with reputation, bodily autonomy, and consent as being themes employed. And it has all been intrinsic to the creative component of my study. The resulting creative work, titled After the Party, can be identified as a crime fiction novel in the subgenre of the domestic noir. My novel explores the ramifications of rape and how an act of sexual violence can be significant within the paradigm of class, gender, and sectarianism, showing how women are triply disadvantaged. Now, the creative work is influenced and informed by the Belfast rape trial of 2018. The case, the text messages between the accused, and the subsequent coverage in media and social media illustrated a culture of toxic masculinity, sexism, and misogyny. Drawing on this case, my creative work explores the interconnectedness of gender and class and looks at how the victim can be demonized and blamed. So in conclusion, while representations of the body in crime fiction are commonplace, the body as a mode of criticism is still underexplored, especially with regards to Northern Irish writing. And I conclude that in examining gender and class through representations of the female body, we can move towards an understanding of the complications of the power dynamics at play. And yet, while these complications can never fully be resolved when society and fictional worlds are rooted in hegemonic masculinity, we've got to remember that that's there. This is our society. And finally, while the trope of the pretty dead female is pervasive in both crime fiction and popular culture and risks making the victim little more than a plot device, I argue that the dead female has potential to illuminate violence against women and has an underlying agency to draw attention to society's contempt of women and their bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. So now we are going to listen to Amy Beddows, who's online. So Amy is a PhD student researching women's experiences of victim blame from agencies following sexual violence at the Child and Women Abuse Studies at London Metropolitan University. Outside of research, she works as a therapist in HE with students who have experienced sexual violence and abuse. She has written academic papers and chapters on the therapeutic value of media, especially the horror genre, and regularly incorporates this tool into her clinical practice. So thank you for Amy.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and how wonderful to go after Sharon. You've given me so much to think about. I'll try not to think about it while I'm giving this talk, but afterwards. So yes, today I'm going to talk about the horror genre and how I think in many ways horror can be a feminist ally to women, despite a lot of the fair criticisms that it faces in terms of misogyny. And I'm going to focus specifically on horror film today. Next slide, please. So the horror genre and misogyny is something that sort of goes hand in hand. Since the genre really erupted in film, understandably, there's been a lot of criticism that it portrays women as victims, that the violence towards women is often highly sexualized, injuries are seen as quite phallic, and the victims are often young, naked, or scantily clad women. And a lot of people have argued that the horror genre in film is primarily aimed at the titillation of a heterosexual male audience. And as some of these horror posters show, that's not an unfair assumption to make. Next slide, please. But one of the questions that comes up is when we look at who watches and engages with horror in terms of cinema audiences, in terms of people who are streaming and buying horror, the audiences are more than 50% women. So if it's misogynistic and sexist, why would women enjoy it? Why would women like me engage with it and find it quite therapeutic? Next slide, please. And I'd argue that horror as a genre, similar to true crime or crime, is a way that we can really explore some of the issues that women face, particularly around violence. So horror as a medium, it can explore sexual abuse, child abuse, domestic violence, as well as some of the lesser depicted forms of violence and oppression that women face, stalking, grooming, image-based abuse, often feature in horror. And particularly around not being believed, women being silenced, not being heard, or being blamed for what is happening to them or what they say is happening to them. That's a common trope in horror film, as well as emotional violence. So not just physical violence, but control, psychological abuse. These all feature within the genre. And one thing I find interesting is these themes come up directly, but also symbolically. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. And I've included some recent films that I think are really good and really interesting examples of exploring these forms of violence against women. Next slide, please. Horror also touches on many issues that women face around body image and puberty. Menstruation is often dealt with, aging, normative restrictions, sexism, pregnancy, abortion, birth, motherhood, daily microaggressions, sexual agency, sexual safety. These are all covered within the horror genre. Next slide, please. And in this way, feminist horror, it's not a new thing. These aren't just recent films. One of my favorite films is 1974's Black Christmas, which is incredibly progressive depiction of young women dealing with things like relationship violence, abortion, stalking, not being believed by police, not being able to trust their male partners. And then in the late 1970s, we had the Alien franchise kick off with one of them, I would argue, one of the most feminist characters in horror / sci-fi, if you're a purist, which is Ellen Ripley. And then in 1991 with Silence of the Lambs, although primarily about true crime, or well, fictional versions of true crime and serial killers and profiling, It follows Clarice Starling as she tries to find a place within a very male-dominated world. And again, it showcases the way she is questioned and belittled and disregarded purely because she's a woman, even though she ends up solving the case and defeating the big bad within the film. Next slide, please. I'm also interested in the kind of more symbolic representations that horror can offer us. These are stills from a film called Paranormal Activity, which kicked off a huge franchise. And it deals on the surface with a young couple who are contending with poltergeist activity within their home. But if a deeper reading of this film, if you care to look at it, is a woman is telling her partner again and again, something's not right, this is what's happening. And he keeps ignoring her, dismissing her, disbelieving her, even when her experiences are validated by outside forces, a priest looking into their background, their history, other people start to see things, he still dismisses her. And to the point that the film reaches a very violent conclusion, all because he wasn't listening to her and believing what she was saying. And I think a lot of us can relate to that, even if we haven't had to deal with demonic forces or poltergeists in our day-to-day lives. Next slide, please. Well, it's true that a lot of the times in horror, women are relegated to victims, to bodies, to injuries. They also get to be the heroes. And this concept of the final girl, although problematic in some ways, it has been recognized as usually the survivor of a horror film is female, and she has to use her resources, her cunning, her wits, rather than physical strength to survive. But women also are witnesses in horror. They are the ones who say something's not right, something's going on, even if they're not believed. They're the ones that see and speak out. In some horror forms, they are the monsters. And again, while this can be problematic, it can also be quite fun. It can be quite powerful to see women eschewing typical gender stereotypes and norms and being powerful or avenging wrongs done against them or others. And so I'd argue, again, these representations, they're not without problems, but they can be fun to watch. And I'd argue they can be quite cathartic as well. Next slide, please. There's this element of catharsis, which is something as a therapist I'm really interested in, because horror can deal with the sort of extreme realities of violence, of physical injury, of rape and sexual abuse, but also the day-to-day realities, the smaller aggressions that we face. I'd argue it can also give us different versions of revenge, of power, of survival, of justice. And I've put a question mark there because I think that's a huge topic outside the scope of today's presentation. But one thing I find interesting is that by witnessing horror, sometimes by overcoming the horror, surviving watching the horror film, that can be therapeutic as well, with the double meaning of watching the characters in the film overcoming their own horrors. So I'm very interested in therapy, this idea of what we can manage in terms of our own agency and autonomy when we're looking at managing or dealing with trauma or exploring trauma. I think horror can be a really useful vehicle for that. Next slide, please. Different forms of resistance is something that horror often touches on. I've taken this list from Jan Jordan's wonderful book, Serial Survivors, and she talks about the many different ways that women resist and survive violence. And whilst physical resistance is the one that's often expected or asked for, particularly in criminal justice settings, horror shows us how women often find ways of talking with the abuser or the threat, using psychology, using empathy, using their surroundings, trying to alert others, trying to draw attention to what's happening, maybe doing the unexpected, maybe looking for a moment where actually they can change the narrative, escape, do something that the abuser isn't expecting them to do. And when all else fails, using mental and inner resources and inner resistance to survive. And again, I think horror, particularly that which focuses on female characters, can really explore this in really interesting and different ways than we're used to seeing in media. Next slide, please. Different forms of justice. The panel that I'm part of this afternoon, we're going to talk a lot more about justice in the media. But whereas horror often shows us justice in terms of evisceration of perpetrators, if I can sort of describe it in that way, which for some people is really cathartic and meaningful and get a lot of therapeutic power from. We also see survivors facing up to their abusers or protecting others. We see people speaking out even through dead bodies. And this, I have to make sense of this following Sharon's presentation, but the autopsy of Jane Doe follows a body. And through her autopsy, she speaks out about what's happened to her and she gets revenge for what's happened to her. Horror often deals with this notion of finding a tribe, and I understand this is quite a problematic phrase, the use of the word tribe, but this phrase in terms of referencing movies is often about female solidarity, finding other women who can understand what they've been through. as well as ways of not just punishing or getting justice for survivors, but humiliating perpetrators. Some horror really deals with how can we kind of get revenge in other ways, or most socially acceptable ways. And films like Black Christmas, I think, do this in really interesting ways. Next slide, please. And I won't talk much about this, but horror really does challenge gender norms. And I think, again, you can tell she's one of my favorites, Ellen Ripley, particularly in the first 3 Alien films. Her arc is really quite powerful, and she really challenges what media and mainstream film usually says is a woman and is a female central character as well. And I think she offers a lot to cinema because of that. Next slide, please. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to move on to my last point, which is this idea of the counterworld. And Mary Daly, the feminist theologian, she talks about the need for an anti-world or a counterworld as the only way to really imagine a world without violence against women and girls, because to sort of achieve that kind of equality, that kind of safety, it requires a full societal transformation. It requires full dismantle of the patriarchy, all the systems, all the institutions and norms that keep it going. And that is something that isn't particularly possible and probably doesn't feel that hopeful, but horror shows us that. Films like Silent Hill, 28 Days Later, even A Quiet Place, it shows us what a complete dismantling of the world and a complete rebuilding could look like. And some of these films, particularly Silent Hill, dabble with the idea of what if it was a matriarchy that was being rebuilt? What if it was women who kind of had more of a say over what happened? And films like We're Going to the World's Fair, they deal with this in a virtual sense as well. How can the internet, how can online worlds be used by women to explore agency and safety and power and justice in different ways? Next slide, please. And a quote from Mary Daly that I really like, she argues that only through women hearing each other can we create this counterworld to the prevailing sense of reality. And I think horror is a space where actually we can have representation of violence against women. We can give voice to women, to not just in terms of the characters, but directors, creators, storytellers, actors. We can have this sense of catharsis, this release, this adrenaline enjoyment of seeing women overcome horrors and women get revenge, and men get what's coming to them in some settings, depending on what they've been doing. We can get this real sense of female solidarity. And if anyone has seen the film Midsummer, there was a lot of problems in that film, I think, in terms of as a female utopia, but there was some really interesting stuff about women supporting women and women being able to express emotion rather than having to suppress it, and being able to be upset rather than having to be strong for the men in their lives. And I'd argue that horror can really give us this different versions of this other world. What could a counterworld look like? And in that way, I think it can give us hope, because a lot of the times when we talk about dismantling patriarchy, making these changes, it can become a bit of a hopeless discussion, because as we've said today, we're scratching the surface. What can we do? How can we actually achieve this space of change? Next slide, please. And of course, a mention to men. What about the men? I think horror, again, it does a wonderful job of exploring toxic masculinity and how patriarchy really does not benefit men, and actually the need for men to get on board with this as well, in really empathic and powerful ways. Films like They Look Like People, Possum, they're not that well known, but my goodness, do they really offer a lot for male survivors, men struggling with mental health, men struggling to find a place in the world. And I think a lot more space needs to be given to these films as well, as arguably as feminist horror, even if they don't really feature women or female characters. Next slide, please. I'm going to wrap up. Thank you so much for letting me talk about something hopefully you can tell I have a real passion for. I use horror quite a lot in my therapy with clients that enjoy horror. I don't force it on anyone. And I have a little bit more information about that on my website if people are interested. I'm also taking part in a documentary which is due to come out next year on mental health and horror. And we talk a little bit about trauma and particularly women who've been through sexual trauma. And I've written a chapter in the Theology in Horror collected edition on female matriarchies in horror and how that can offer us this counter world. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop talking now.
Thank you so much, Amy, for your presentation. Now we are going to listen to Stella Gottmet, who is a PhD student in performing arts at Canterbury Christchurch University. Through her research, she explores ways of deconstructing representations of mad women in realist theatre using different performance practices. Her creative works include playwriting, devising, and performance. Her career trajectory evidences over a decade of engagement with storytelling as a means to comprehend and respond to the treatment of what was perceived of as female madness in society. She's experienced in working independently as well as with a team and her own company, Fleet of Feet Theatre, to navigate the adaptation of historical events and social issues for public performance.
Hi. So in this paper, I'm going to explore using madness as methodology to deconstruct victimizing narratives and find new ways of staging them. In his 1547 writing Gargantua, the third book, philosopher François Rabelais introduces the figure of the madman, a character whose perception of events allows us to acknowledge the value of apprehending the world through a different light. Rabelais tells the story of a poor, starving man who, with only a piece of bread for supper, satisfies his hunger with the smell of roasting chickens. At first, the chicken vendor doesn't object. However, he soon demands the poor man pay him for stealing the smell of his chickens, explaining how bland his piece of bread would have tasted without the scent of his succulent meat. The poor man protests, "Your chickens are still there, you can sell them." An argument erupts between the two, attracting the attention of the townspeople. Eventually, a madman is called to the scene to settle the disagreement. The madman asks the poor man to hand him all the money he has. Then he puts the fistful of coins to the vendor's ear and shakes it. A clinking sound is heard as the coins are tossed together. The coins are then handed back to their owner. The madman explains, "This man has been feeding off the smell of your roasting chickens. You have been paid with the sound of his money." Free from the constraints of rationality, the madman could resolve tricky situations, and this resulted in his being held in high esteem within society. This paper will explore the possibility of using madness as methodology to challenge the traditional victimizing constructs of female narratives by changing the way that stories are told. My approach is to examine different creative processes which contribute to breaking the habit of building chronological, linear narratives, relying on familiar frames of reference. The desired outcome of this process is to overturn both the spectators' and the creators' thinking habits. This I will attempt to illustrate in a performance piece, which I am developing as part of my doctoral research. I have drawn on some of the methods and performance practices explored by philosopher Ken Gale in Madness as Methodology, and on theatre maker Katie Mitchell's approach to staging new narratives. According to Gale, the state of délire or madness, which can only be accessed in opposition to the rules which govern the confining frame of reason, colors the prism through which we perceive the world and the narratives which unfold within it. Gale explains, etymologically, délire is to leave the furrow, go off the rails, and wander in imagination, rather than calmly following the familiar lines or tracks of cold reason. In theatre and adaptation, return, rewrite, repeat, theatre director Katie Mitchell defines the impulse which drives her creative practice, and as an attempt to represent consciousness and modes of perception on stage. This implies focusing less on the narrative and action and more on behavior and how a character looks out at the world. Both Katie Mitchell's and Ken Gale's approach inform the performance piece I mentioned earlier, which is based on Henrik Ibsen's Hedda Gabler. Written in 1890, this realist play tells the story of the title character Hedda, who, feeling trapped in the domestic life resulting from her marriage and faced with social failure, takes her own life and that of her unborn child. Through my performance practice, I have attempted to find new ways of staging Hedda's story. using an alternative prism which gives focus to the character's psychological and emotional journey within the social structure in which she is confined. Okay. Hedda's story is reimagined in a non-linear way. Yes, it's very basic, but Hedda's story is reimagined in a non-linear way using complementary languages. Movement sequences are used as a means of allowing the range of emotions and tensions which move the character to be embodied by the performer, whilst the text attempts to create an alternative, non-victimizing frame for the character's narrative. In Ibsen's play, Hedda is confined to the domestic sphere. The character and set imagined by Ibsen form the negative space Hedda must set herself against in order to exist. The aim of the piece, which you are about to see, is to offer Hedda a different backdrop against which she can be perceived, independently from her male counterparts, through whose gaze she is represented in Ibsen's writing. In this space, restrained aspects of Hedda's identities are released and expressed, allowing her to take ownership of her environment and exist outside the domestic and public sphere. There should be sound. Oh.
A big house which stands at the end of a long gravelled path, behind high garden gates and green garden railings. A big house where few have been, and many have yet to come. In spring, the steel-barred fence which circles the house vanishes beneath wild branches and climbing trees. And behind the garden walls she waits for the others, entertainment seekers, party-goers, gossip spreaders, company keepers. The woman impatiently longs for guests to come to her place, a vast and empty house where too many ink-soaked pages filled shelves, cover tables, stacks of books with only unfading flower bouquets to compete with. The woman is circumspect, always dignified. Her steel grey eyes piercing, clever. With her cold and clear stare, she casts envy around her. Never late or sorry. They say she's peculiar, a general's daughter, riding along the city streets in a long black habit, riding along the town's cobbled road, riding with her father. She wears big feathers in her hats and her fine hair, up in a bun. Some say she can be heard at dawn, cocking her loaded pistols, laying traps when needed, for the unwanted. She is said to aim her weapons at strangers who trespass, at men who pass the front gates. Some believe, hope, they can get away with calling her the general's daughter. She is often mentioned as the wife of a doctor, but the most foolish of the lot dare speak of her as the untouchable lover, a waste of a mother. It is dawn when the cold muzzle of the gun meets the right side of her head. It is early morning when the trigger is pulled, and the shot is fired through her head, and the whispers slither through the neighborhoods. An entire community spreading the story in unison, brought together by its scandal. They tell the story to one another, over supper, tea, or at cocktail parties, between two dances, a sip, a smoke, another dance, a sip, a slurp, a smoke, and too many uttered words. In the town, the gossip grows. Where did it begin?
The creative process I have used involved 3 stages of development. I began by devising a physical score, so creating a sequence of movements influenced by Etienne de Cruz's corporal mime, Indian martial art Kalaripayattu, and inspired by images and photos. Different layers of movements compose the physical score. In this way, a first non-linear narrative is built, representing, as Katie Mitchell explains, an ordinary person living a much more fragmented, shifting sense of reality. The second stage of development involved bringing the piece outside of the rehearsal space and performing it outdoors, experimenting with performing in different weather conditions and at different times of the day. In the film piece, the character moves against a natural landscape composed of the straight lines of tree trunks, which contrast with the unpredictable movement of the wind, which changes the dynamic of the scene. The daylight gradually fades as the piece unfolds and darkness falls. This transition from day to night, as well as the contrasting qualities of the natural landscape, can be perceived as a metaphor for Hedda's journey. Her search for freedom, which is frustrated by her fear of the condemnation which will result from her breaching social norms. Finally, attempting to add a new dimension to the play and give voice to Hedda, I began writing her obituary. I chose to revisit Hedda's life journey through the 3 major roles which determined the course of her existence. First as General Gabler's daughter, then as Lovborg's lover, before becoming Tesman's wife. This is an omniscient monologue written in the 3rd person, as if someone had been watching her and taking ownership of her story. But it is Hedda's voice which can be heard talking about herself in the 3rd person. In this monologue, I wanted to illustrate how text can also be used to lead narratives out of traditional constructs and draw attention to another aspect of a character's story, the vulnerable psychological inner journey. The process of staging nonlinear narratives may cause confusion for the performer and the theater maker. Yet it is against the backdrop of such a seemingly fragmented performance practice that details emerge, which can hopefully interrogate the spectator and the creator and shape new meanings. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. Now we are going to listen to Maria Butler. So Maria is a 3rd-year PhD candidate in the School of English and Digital Humanities at the University College Cork. Maria's project, Maria and Keys and the Irish Social Literary Landscape, a critical analysis using close and distant reading, is jointly funded by the Irish Research Council and the National Library of Ireland through the IRC Enterprise Partnership Scheme.
Great, thanks. Hi everyone, thanks for bearing with me so close to lunchtime. I'll try not to be too long. Today I'm going to talk to you about how women's commercial fiction, especially chick lit, can be used as a Trojan horse through which to educate readers about issues affecting women. In this case, I'll be speaking about how Marion Keyes' 2009 novel, This Charming Man, teaches readers about some of the realities of intimate partner abuse in the Republic of Ireland. So I like to use this slide from this still from Legally Blonde in presentations because I think it represents chick lit fairly well. It is girly, but like Elle Woods, it can have something important to say. So I feel like it's a good visual metaphor for the genre. Chick lit is a genre of women's commercial fiction which originated in the mid-1990s with the publication of American author Terry McMillan's Waiting to Exhale in 1992, Irish author Key's first two novels, Watermelon in 1995 and Lucy Sullivan is Getting Married in 1996. And of course, English author Helen Fielding's Bridget Jones's Diary in 1996. Chick lit books generally follow single urban women in their 20s and 30s as they navigate a variety of trials and tribulations in their careers, their love lives, and their friendships. A descendant of the romance blockbusters of the 1980s and early 90s, chick lit books always have a happy ending. Often dismissed as fluff, these novels can provide an ideal forum through which to promote women-led educational and activist messages for several reasons. So, first of all, if commercial fiction is successful, it can reach a large audience, which means its message will be widely disseminated. For example, Marion Keyes has sold over 30 million books in 33 languages. And the book which I'm talking about today, This Charming Man, was voted as the winner of the popular fiction novel in the Irish Book Awards the year that it was released. Despite its popularity, chick lit is rarely read by heterosexual men. Indeed, early responses to the genre by male reviewers were unnecessarily violent. Alex O'Connell in The Times wrote of seeing women reading these books on the tube making his knuckles blanch, while Liam Fay in The Sunday Times likened it to, quote, the fiction writing equivalent of a livid pink rash, whose stylistic indicators had begun to infect other areas of popular storytelling with predictably flaky consequences, end quote. These attitudes towards materials written by women for women do not reflect favorably on the men who promoted them. However, the upshot of this type of attitude is that it allows chick lit to function as a space through which female authors can impart information to female readers relatively safe in the knowledge that it is unlikely to be intercepted by men. So the third one then is, due to its reputation as non-serious, readers are unlikely to expect chick lit to function as an activist or educational space. According to psychologists Freidstedt and Wright's persuasion knowledge model, people adapt over time to become aware of the various avenues that can be used to persuade them of something. They posit that as people become aware of attempts to persuade them, they are less susceptible to being convinced. Therefore, chick lit's reputation as fluff may help authors to teach readers precisely because readers aren't expecting it. And finally, according to cognitive literary theorist Mark Bracker, facts and figures are less likely to convince people that they're holding on to incorrect or faulty assumptions. However, repeated exposure to narratives which correct people's faulty internal thought processes and shorthands, which he refers to as cognitive schemas, through introducing them to alternative examples and prototype scenarios to those which fuel their original cognitive schemas, can change people's inherited core beliefs, which are built through their exposure to ideologies at home, school, the media, basically everything that surrounds you all the time. With these points in mind, I will now discuss Marion Keyes' This Charming Man. This novel is a multi-strand narrative following three women, stylist Lola, journalist Grace, and alcoholic Marnie, in the months following the engagement of the announcement of politician Paddy de Courcy, a violent abuser who plays a significant role in each woman's life. This Charming Man touches upon many issues relating to gender-based violence. It shows how Ireland fails victims of human trafficking. It counteracts the stereotype of the battered wife by offering examples of a variety of women in abusive relationships, including a teenager, a film star, an athlete, a politician, and a socialite. They are all predominantly white, or we're not told anybody's not white, but it still does offer a slight variation. It demonstrates the escalation of abuse within relationships and explores the narratives both abusers and victims can tell themselves during the cycle of abuse. As you can imagine, this is way too much to cover in one paper. So today I'm just going to look at how This Charming Man educates readers on the failure of the Irish justice system to protect victims of intimate partner abuse. So according to Mark Bracker, to change a person's faulty schema, they must first become aware of their flawed thinking. A prominent schema amongst those not knowledgeable about intimate partner abuse is that victims are at least somewhat to blame for their failure to involve the police. This schema is addressed through This Charming Man, as Keyes illustrates law enforcement's ineffectiveness in intercepting intimate partner abuse cases. Throughout the text, various characters such as Grace and Marnie act as a proxy for the reader by asking why victims of domestic abuse don't just report their abusers to the police. This allows this charming man to educate readers on the failure of the justice system because, quote, when you heard that someone had been hurt by someone else, the automatic response was to suggest that they went to the police, end quote. That's by a character who is a victim of Paddy de Courcy as well. The reader is educated in several ways throughout the text. We are privy to scenes which illustrate the experiences of victims of intimate partner abuse throughout the narrative. However, there are also didactic scenes which function on a purely informative basis. One such scene is Grace's interview with the director of Women's Aid for an article she writes on domestic violence. This expert teaches readers through Grace about the psychological manipulation of victims to convince them that their abuser will change their behaviours. So, why doesn't she ring the Rossers? Because he keeps promising he'll change, Laura said, that he won't do it again. On average, a woman is hit 35 separate times before she contacts the police. 35 times? No, that can't be right. Yes, 35 times. However, highlighting this manipulation is not enough to change readers' faulty cognitive schemas. Readers are challenged further through several examples of police officers failing to assist injured women throughout the novel. One such incident is narrated by protagonist Lola, who recalls an incident when Paddy, her boyfriend at the time, threw her into a shelf which fell on top of her and injured her. Lola's neighbours called the police, aware that something negative was going on. The police arrived to find Lola injured with blood pouring down her face. They, the police, looked at me. You like to tell us what's going on? The woman was kindly. What's your name? Lola? What happened to your face, Lola? Paddy loomed behind them and said, Officers, can my friend and I have a moment alone? The two peelers gave each other a look. Please, Paddy said with an air of great authority. The two peelers gave each other another look. Female peeler shook her head softly, but male peeler said, okay, 1 minute only. Female peeler glared at male peeler, then she sighed and they backed out from the room. This exchange prompts readers to ask why a police officer would allow an injured woman to be left alone with her potential aggressor, particularly after they had been called out on a domestic disturbance call. While the police are out of the room, Paddy convinces Lola against telling the truth. The peelers were permitted to re-enter the room and Paddy gave them a smooth story about me up on the chair trying to reach something on the top shelf of hall cupboard when I slipped, fell off, landed on my face, bringing cupboard down with me. They knew we were lying. Male peeler cheery enough, we'll leave you to it so, but woman peeler concerned, kindly eyes, reluctant to go. Thus, we can see that even when the police are called to attend a violent incident, it might not help, especially if one of the police officers defers to the aggressor. The female police officer's reluctance to leave the scene also indicates that the police may not be able to help even if they want to. The police's inability to help victims of domestic abuse is revisited several times throughout the text. So towards the end of the novel, we meet a whole bunch of Paddy's ex-girlfriends because they go to confront him en masse. So Selma is a mountaineer and she tells us, I did go to the I did go to the cops 4 separate times. My God, Zara said, I'm surprised you're still alive. So how did he wriggle out of any charges? You know what he's like, Selma said scornfully. He always talked me out of it, swore to me on his mother's memory that he'd never touch me again, blamed it on his job being stressful, the usual. And Pico here bought it every time, kept thinking he would be different, hope sprang eternal. And then Zara, another one of his ex-girlfriends, I made the mistake of going to the police. He was so angry, I thought he was going to kill me. She went to the police. And was he charged? How had he kept that out of the press? Not at all. She rolled her eyes. These 2 fat Egypts showed up in their yellow jackets, and as soon as they'd established it was only a domestic, they told us to kiss and make up. Then we're off down the road to buy chips and batter burgers. All I could do was apply for a barring order, which would take 12 weeks. By then I was long gone. In total, we learn of 6 separate incidences involving 3 different women when the police were called on Paddy throughout the course of the novel. Despite this, there is no record of Paddy's abuse towards women, and he is touted as a future Taoiseach of Ireland. Each of these instances underlines the failure of the Irish judicial system to protect victims of domestic and intimate partner abuse. Furthermore, each incident shows readers how seeking help from the police is not always helpful, thereby challenging the existing cognitive schema of call the police. If anything, these scenarios show readers how approaching the police can be dangerous. The above references to Paddy potentially killing his victims for going to the police are consistent with evidence that victims are in the most danger while trying to leave their abusers. This danger is explicitly imparted to Grace by the Women's Aid director earlier in the text. When she left him, he'd sworn he'd find her and kill her, and so he did, in front of their children. And her children had no mother or father, I suppose, if he was in prison. He wasn't in prison. The judge felt sorry for him. He walked free on a suspended sentence. No, it happens a lot. Thus, this charming man teaches the reader that there are insufficient legal protections afforded to victims of intimate partner violence in Ireland. Readers learn why victims may be reluctant to approach the police, that police officers have insufficient training in how to handle these types of situations, that the existing legislation does not facilitate the protection of victims and potential victims, and that even in the most extreme cases, it is possible for perpetrators to walk away scot-free from their crimes. Educating the reader about their faulty schema is the first step in bringing about change. Once the reader knows that there are institutional mechanisms which directly contribute towards violence against women, they can begin to recognize when they are faced with them outside of fiction. According to Bracker, new schemers must be used multiple times in many different contexts to stick. Unfortunately, the prevalence of news stories relating to violence against women is such that readers have plenty of opportunity to use this schema of the justice system facilitating violence against women. Novels like This Charming Man show readers where the institutional faults lie. Therefore, when we see these headlines, we are more likely to blame the flawed judiciary rather than thinking of these events as tragic anomalies. This in turn encourages us to speak out and take positive action against gender-based violence. This action can take many forms, for example, supporting friends in need rather than sending them to the police, donating to relevant charities, or lobbying politicians for change. Thank you.